This is the Grow Dino graph setup notes. All right, when you're working the lab today, when you're setting up the lab, you'll find that you need to set up some graphs. You have several pieces of paper that look like charts. The very first one actually asks for the outline of the Grow Dinos. These aren't graphs. These are going to be drawings of dinosaurs. So here you would have your dinosaur, and then you'd have several other drawings of different sizes on this chart. So this is the outline. That's the first page. As you move down, the next one is length, thickness, and perimeter. Now, if you look closely, it actually says what to label the X and Y axis. It says it right here. It says label the X-axis days and the Y-axis centimeters. And then it tells you you need to graph length, height, thickness, and perimeter. Now, what this is if you remember when we were discussing graphing for the sponge animal lab, it takes two numbers to make a dot. So you're making 4 lines. You are making a line. You are making a line for length, a line for height, a line for thickness, and a line for perimeter. For your line for length, the two numbers you're using for one dot are your number here and the day 1. Number and day 2, number and day 3, number and day 4, number and day 5. So you actually, nope, not number and day 5. She'll have 4 dots for length because these are the two numbers that make the 4 dots. When you move on to height, you'll take this number and day 1, this number and day 2, this number and day 3, this number and day 4. Then you'll color code it. So when you do thickness, it'll be this number and day 1, this number and day 2, this number and day 3, this number and day 4. Hopefully with that explanation you can figure out what you need to do for perimeter. When you actually set up the graph, you need to figure out what the biggest number is that you need to get on the graph. Most of the time, it is only 34. All right? So that means there's 17 boxes here. And if you go up by 2s, it'll get you to 34. What you need to look at is your perimeter number, because your perimeter number will tell you what is the biggest number you need to get on here. So if you actually need to go up higher, say to 50, the next highest number is 51. So if your biggest number is 34 or less, you go up by 2s. If your number is 51 or less, then you go up by 3s. So what you do is the corner is 0, 2, 4, 6. And if you remember when we discussed in class about how you set the numbers up, you always want to make sure that your numbers line up and are cut through by the lines that are on the graph. Okay? So if you're going up by 2s, each box represents 2 centimeters. And you're going to write that across the side here, that this is centimeters. And it is the amount you're going up by. As you go across the bottom, it says that you're going up by days. So as you go across the bottom, you're only going to have 4 days. Well, there's a whole lot of boxes here. So we're going to actually go every 3 boxes is a day. So this one's day 1, 3 boxes, day 2. And I recommend that you actually stack it. So it's day 1, day 2, because if you write too big, 3, 4. And once again, you want the line to cut through your number. So this is your setup. Once your setup is finished, and mine isn't, then you're going to graph your 4 lines, and they're going to be color-coded. So you're going to have to write up here that maybe black is thickness, and then you'll have your 4 thickness dots, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you'll connect them. Now, since your dinosaur was never 0 thickness, you do not connect between day 1 and day 0, because it was never 0 thickness. But then you would change colors and use a colored pencil, and then you would make the next one might be height. And you have your 4 dots for height. And then you would change colors, length, and then you change colors for perimeter. When you're done, your graph will look something like this. Now, is it possible that you might have these lines crossing over each other? Yeah, that's fine. But when you're done, you'll only have 4 lines, and those 4 lines will be different colors. And you should have labeled those colors. Preferably, if you could get them to fit in this margin, that would be great, because I can't really write that small with this tool. So if you could get these 4 color codes in this margin, that's really what you should do. So that's how you set up the first graph. The second graph follows the same rules, except that you're still looking at, but this graph is only going to have one thing. So again, when you're looking at it, if you have your biggest mass is, what was it, 17? If your biggest mass is 34 or less, if your biggest mass is 17 or less, you go up by 1s. If your biggest mass is 34 or less, you go up by 2s. If your biggest mass is 51 or less, you go up by 3s. Most of you will probably be going up by 2s. All right, and then across the bottom, you still have days. So you want mass going up, and that's going to be in grams, and you're probably going to go up by 2s, and then across the bottom, you're going to have days. And it's just like the last one where you go every 3. Now, using the information that I've discussed for length, height, thickness, and perimeter, and for the mass of the Grow Dino, you need to do volume on your own. It follows the same rules. You need to figure out what the biggest volume you're going to get on here is, and you use the same days across the bottom, the mass and the volume only have one line on them. So when you're done, they will look roughly like that. Just one line. The last graph is a little bit more complicated because what I need you to do is, it says independent graph, but notice how it's crossed out and that I have written in density versus time, and here I have boxed out density versus time. Let's change this to here. All right, so that means that I want you to do density versus time on this. Now your biggest density was probably less than 2. So in order to make this graph effective, you need to know what to go up by. This one's not one, this one's one I want to tell you what to go up by. I want you to go up by 0.2. Now, many of you have a hard time with that. It works like this. It's 0.2, and the next one is 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, 1. Now, a lot of people then go from 1 straight to 2. And this is where you screw up, because the next one's not 1, it's 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, 2. Hopefully you can get that transition to get the rest of that. Over here is still days. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. All right, so this is days down here, and this is density going up. Now I want you to do something a little bit unique with this graph, in that I want you to highlight, find a highlighter or something, and highlight a mark right around 1. All right? Right around 1. And the idea is that when you have a density that's above this line, your object sinks, and your density is below this line, the object should have floated. All right? You will probably have to round. If you've got something that's 0.9, it's going to end up here. If you've got something that is 1.12, it's going to end up here. And actually, I want you to highlight, and let's make that a highlighter here, all the way between 0.8 and 1.2. The reason is your tools are not very accurate, so anything in this highlighted zone could be considered a density of 1. So if you have a density below this mark and you said it sunk, but your density should have said it floated, then you probably had a math error. If you have above this mark, then, or in the mark, then you're fine.